So the ego has an important role to play, but the problem is that it often exceeds the bounds of its role because it doesn't like really know any better. So one place to go with working with the ego is to really define like what is its role and what is not its role. The ego is very good at the things of like our physical life, like not getting killed by a tiger or like setting your alarm to get to work on time or things like paying the bills, before they're due, like driving on the right side of the street. Our egos are so well developed precisely because for millions of years, like these physical skills were like actually the most important skills for the vast majority of people. However, the ego is very poorly suited to higher order cognition, like figuring out where to make like leaps of faith and hearing the voice of the divine, and especially like honoring those impulses that come through us. So things like, oh, I should like get that healing done on me, or oh, I should attend that talk tonight, or oh, I should call my father and apologize, even though I've done nothing wrong. Like triaging these different impulses and acting on them is not where the ego shines at all. Because the ego really likes certainty and sameness and like routine, it wants above all like safety. It wants safety so that it can actually live another day. Like that's its job. So one step to working with the ego is to become clear when you should listen to its direction and when you should actually resist its guidance and look elsewhere. And so this requires us to really like step outside of our ego and outside of the chatter of our minds and outside of like the logical reasoning part of us and like really outside of the norm of our culture and step into becoming kind of like a higher adult, like to stand in the position of the wise adult to the child that is the ego self. Jung called this process of like doing this individuation, which is really like a really good term for this because it implies within it a maturation process that leads you to become like more you. And similarly, so much of our teaching also emphasizes that the journey of spiritual progression is not to become like less you, right? It's to become more you. And that as you grow spiritually, what you're doing is stripping away all of the things that are not you so that you can become more you. And that sounds like kind of familiar to us, right? Maybe Jung like got his ideas from somewhere. And once we can accept that the ego should not always be in the driver's seat, then the work of wrestling with the ego begins. And in order to be effective at this, it is very helpful to consider ways to like loosen up the ego's grip over us. So in other words, in order for us to become like independent and individuated beings, we need the shift from the ego, or we need to shift the ego from like being the driver to being like an advisor, but where we're the ultimate decider of what happens. And so in order to do that, it can be helpful to step into a space of questioning the ego very carefully and gently. So questioning the ego really requires us to enter a different space, like a liminal space or a separate space, especially in the beginning, where, the ego's grip is like it's strong, and it has a grip over us. And that grip over us has been totally unexamined, however it shows up in our lives. So it's really helpful to establish a space that is separate where we go to examine ourselves. And a few like different ideas for this are a regular visit with like a skilled therapist, and like someone that really invites us to reflect deeper on our behaviors and the deeper meaning of them. Or another idea is a regular journaling practice where we're not just like spitting out all the contents of the day, although like that totally can be helpful sometimes, but a practice where we're actually really probing deeper and asking ourselves why, you know? And it can look like a series of questions that we ask ourselves to hold like our behaviors and internal motivations like up to a philosophy, kind of in the way like ancient philosophers may have done. And one place that we work with a ton of questions like this is in Kabbalah, which I think most of you on this call have been through, so you know the millions of questions for contemplation we do. So if that sounds interesting to you, it might be something that you want to consider possibly in the future. And I think Kabbalah is on the books for next year. So we need to begin by like just allowing ourselves space and creating space to go deeper and to really take like our own thoughts and behaviors and examine them and really look at them. But most importantly, to question them. It's the act of questioning our motivation and our behaviors and like our actions. Like, why did I just do that? That we begin to actually loosen the ego's grip on us. So for example, like if I'm convinced that someone totally wronged me, like maybe I'm going through a breakup or something, right? And just like ruminating on all the things that my partner did that I think like wounded or hurt me or wronged me, right? Then the ego is going to be inclined to like continue that stream of rumination. So in order to create space and, remember again, like at this point, we're only creating space. So in order to create space from the grip of the ego, we can really flip this whole conversation around and ask ourselves questions like, well, is that really true? Like it's such like a simple question, but if we come to the question really honestly, we often can see that the rumination that is in our brain, like this cycle, the thing we spin on, is really just a story. And it's not usually the whole story, right? But rather a story that supports a narrative position. And that position is the position of the ego. So we can ask ourselves, is that really true? Like, in order to create the space that our ego's position may not actually be the correct position.